I'm John Letman, and I am the chair of the Town of Rockingham Historic Preservation Commission, just co-sponsoring this. Ann Dempsey, whose picture is right above mine in the screen I've got in front of me, is representing the Rockingham Free Public Library, which is also, I believe, sponsoring this event this evening. This is in a way a rerun, or at least a new edition of a presentation that was done in 2020, late in 2021, and certainly pleased to welcome everyone who's here this evening to a presentation about the Rockingham Meeting House, about paint, about colors, and about history. Our guest this evening is Dr. Susan Buck, who is a renowned art conservator who specializes in paint and finish analysis for art objects and architecture. Dr. Buck runs her own lab in Williamsburg, Virginia, teaches part-time in the Winter Tour University of Delaware graduate program in art conservation. She's known internationally for her historic preservation detective work at landmarks such as Colonial Williamsburg, Mount Vernon, Monticello. And if we have time today, get her to tell us some of the stories about some of the things she's found in those places. Has worked at UNESCO World Heritage sites such as Beijing's Forbidden City. And if you're talking about interesting colors and paint, I can't imagine a better place to do it than that. As a conservator, she applies the science of art conservation to architectural restoration. In early August, when it was a little warmer than it is now, Dr. Buck spent several days on site collecting paint and wood samples from the interior and exterior of the Rockingham Meeting House, as well as from the 1816 hearse that's housed there, the funeral bier, and the hearse barn that are part of this National Historic Landmark. Back at our Williamsburg laboratory, these samples were examined microscopically and with colorimetry to determine colors and chemical compositions of the various finishes used over the past 223 years on what sometimes could be called the Old Town Barn. And I don't know whether Walter is prepared to show us his photoshopped picture of what the meeting house looked like when it was painted like a barn, but we'll get to that. Today, she will introduce us to her techniques and approaches and report about her findings. So Dr. Buck, take it away.
Thank you. I am glad to have a return lecture, because this really is such a fascinating building with a remarkable amount of early paint evidence surviving. And as you can see, when I was there, the weather was warm and beautiful, and this building stands out against the landscape in the most elegant way. So when I work on these types of architecture projects, I'm interested not only in what the colors are, and I have to say, I hope that this connection stays, because I got a little notice my internet connection was unstable, but we're just going to forge ahead here. So there's some evocative images in the Rockingham Free Public Library website. This one shows the building in this monochromatic form, but in use. So clearly a lively, exciting day at the Rockingham Meeting House in the summer. And it contrasts with some of the starker images in the Historic American Buildings site that show it as a documented form, but not in use. So again, a monochromatic form in 1934. And then in a date range pretty wide, mid 20th century, we again see this monochromatic building and the hearse next to it. So this hearse, which is in an adjacent hearse barn, is remarkable. It has never had a major restoration, and finish analysis shows all the original finishes are still intact, and it simply had some recoating to kind of freshen it, but it's untouched, which is just an amazing survivor. Usually these transportation vehicles undergo pretty significant restorations. So this hearse and the building itself are important survivors. I love this interior image of the meeting house, filled with people clearly celebrating. And in terms of looking at paints, you see that this woodwork is quite light, but it's not as light as the plaster walls. And then we see woodwork up on the top top level is dark, so it still remains unpainted. So there are portions of this meeting house which have basically never been painted and still retain their original surfaces. So the meeting house underwent a pretty major restoration in 1906 and 1907 at the time this pulpit was replaced. So this is the later pulpit, as well as a few rows of benches at the front. But all of this evidence remains in these original pews, and we've got surfaces that have been respected and really left remarkably untouched in terms of recoating. And I'll show you what that means with these cross sections. So this is my lab in my home, and my primary tool is this epifluorescence microscope, basically a hospital research microscope that allows me to look at cast cross-section samples. Those show the layers of coatings from the bottom, like the wood or the plaster, to the top. And these tiny samples are mounted in polyester resin cubes, which are polished to expose the cross-section. And it's like looking at the stratigraphy of a rock, for example, under the microscopes. You have a very decipherable layer structure, and these then can be photographed and the images managed through digital imaging. And I also have 3 different ultraviolet cubes with this microscope, which allows me to look at different types of materials, which have certain autofluorescence colors, and look at organic components of paint layers. And I'll talk more about this. And for pigments, think of these colorants that are in the paints in their dry pigment form. So every pigment has its own shape, size, color, and set of optical properties. So you can cast a dispersion of pigments, 1 pigment layer thick, onto a microscope slide and send light up through the sample. And this allows you to identify pigment types both by their individual properties and by comparison with standards. So I collect pigments, and these are some of my standard comparative pigments. Then I also have a colorimeter microscope. So this allows me to measure and document color in standard color systems like Munsell and CIE LAB, which give me numeric readings for color from actual samples. Then I can compare those to commercial matches, for example, in Benjamin Moore or Sherwin-Williams, and see how close they come in terms of replicating a color. So here's this elegant and very light-filled space, quite an inspiring space. We're looking at, to the north where the pulpit is. Now, this is all original, although the pulpit itself has been replaced. And you can see it's darkened. It's a darker color than surrounding woodwork. It's kind of an olive green, whereas these elements like the posts are a light gray paint. And then the balcony woodwork has a kind of pale grayish blue color. So one question we face when we look at these types of surfaces is, how many layers of paint are on them and how have the colors changed over time. And that means taking tiny cross sections, some as small as a pinhead, in protected areas to document them. Now, you can also use a floor plan for reference, which I use for locating my sample locations. So I can always go back to the same location and make sure I understand where I took that sample. But you have an entrance on the south elevation and an aisle that leads you straight to the pulpit and the Palladian window behind. And then two separate entrances on the east and west for access to the side pews. Now, while I was there, Walter Wallace found some decorative elements that actually were in storage in the adjacent barn. This is hugely helpful because they're protected areas of paint that flowed around the back, so didn't get as exposed to light and might even represent more of the original color than we can see on the faded and degraded front surface. So these were sampled for analysis. So here we have a cross section. This is your first cross section in this presentation. These are the wood fibers here in visible light. And there's only one paint layer right here with an eroded surface, kind of grimy, and you can see small blue particles mixed into it. Right? So this is a light blue paint, and it flowed deep into the wood. So that confirms it's the original paint on this surface. But sometimes, something that's been exposed like this for a long time may change color. It could darken depending on the binding component, or if it's exposed to light, become quite bleached. And when you see it in a cross section from one of the gray posts, in this case, we have two layers of paint, the wood at the bottom. Here's that same light blue, and this is the top of that layer, and it is blanched quite almost to white. And then it was covered over with the light gray paint that's there now, right? So two generations of paint here. And we clearly have these posts picked out in the same light blue as what we see on the balcony. Then we can use these same cross-section samples, and in different ultraviolet light illuminations, we can look for organic components. Now, this is stains adapted from cell biology. So in this case, I'm using a stain called TTC for carbohydrates before staining and after. We've got some staining on the surface, but not really within the paints. This is dichlorofluorescein for oils. Definitely lots of oil reaction in both layers and in the wood, so the paint soaked in. And then for proteins, no reactions for protein. So we basically have oil-bound paints here. And this is a dispersion of that light blue paint layer crushed onto a microscope slide and made to be one layer thick. And you see these big blue particles. This is classic Prussian blue, ferrocyanide, a pigment invented in Berlin in 1704, but we have documentation that it made its way out to the Connecticut River Valley area by 1715. It is the most ubiquitous blue in these types of architectural paints. And here we have it in that light blue paint. Now, Prussian blue also can be light sensitive. So it may have blanched slightly. And I think that's what we see in the cross sections. So in dry pigment form, it's a very deep, rich, dark blue. It's called a high tint strength pigment. So it doesn't take much Prussian blue to make a white lead based paint blue. And so that's what we see here. This is a lovely light blue paint. And here are the Prussian blue particles kind of widely dispersed throughout it. Classic 18th century paint material. Now up on the soundboard, it was also possible to take samples from a ladder. It's a very different color than anything else in this space. And it started off different as well. So here's the wood again. Then we have the first layer is this coarsely ground yellowish gray with big clumps of yellow. So this is classic hand ground paint where the pigments aren't very well dispersed. Then it's repainted 3 more times with greenish yellow, dull yellow, and the current light olive green. And you look for the boundaries between the layers to see whether a layer has dried down and been exposed for a while. And you can see these boundaries as well in reflected UV light. So the current light olive green is probably the 1906-07 layer, but it was probably mimicking the previous greenish yellow, dull yellows that had been on there before. And we see this same gray on the soundboard as well as the Palladian window woodwork. So that part of the building, the woodwork was painted to match, different from the light blue that you see on the posts and the balcony. Right, so it was meant to stand out. Now the pews are a different question. So these darkened surfaces are not just discoloration. They can be a problem in the summer when it's quite warm. So if people are sitting in this space for a wedding or a lecture on a warm, moist summer day, they may end up taking home some of this darkened stain on their clothing. So one big question is, what is it and what can be done about it? So again, this was sampled and there's no paint. You see, there's no coating. We look at it in visible light, it's kind of darkened, but there's no layer on top. You see this darkening in the UV light sample. And when it's stained for oils, you see a lot of oily material in the wood on the surface. So this is likely from maintenance, linseed oil with a drying agent applied regularly to kind of resaturate the wood. People call it feeding the wood, which is really not what you want to do. But basically, I think what we're getting is oily materials which have darkened over time. And when they're warm, they kind of migrate through the wood onto anyone who's sitting there. So now the exterior is a different issue, and it's also so much harder to find intact exterior paints because buildings are weathered and they crack and flake. And for restorations, there's usually much more aggressive stripping and sanding of exteriors because the paints become grimy and damaged and cracked. So fortunately, a very willing volunteer was able to get up to the cornice to take some samples for me. This was just a little too high, but it turned out that this cornice is stripped pretty much down to bare wood. Again, I think that actually happens after 1906, sometime in the mid 20th century, perhaps. Not much paint evidence on many parts of the exterior. But we did find this fragment of a clapboard in the storage barn. And if you look carefully at the edge, you see deep red. And I took a sample from right at the edge where some of these weathered paints were still intact. And looking at other parts of the building, like this door reveal, you see deeply cracked paints and remnants of what had worn down, which looks like a dark red, right? So I took another sample there. And you see a very definite layer of dark red paint, certainly much more intact on the reveal. Here it is at the bottom, painted over then with a kind of cream color, lighter cream colors up to the most recent bright white. And on that weathered clapboard, you see the red paint is fairly broken up, but it's there and it penetrated into the wood, which is clearly evidence of it being the original coating. And it gets very eroded and weathered before it's painted over with an off-white. So this red paint was in place for quite some time. I mean, could be decades before it was painted over with lighter colors, going from cream colors to progressively brighter white as you get to the top. And we find this deep red on the door reveal, on the clapboard, on doors, and on door openings. So clearly it's there and was allowed to become quite degraded before it was painted over. And from a dispersed pigment sample, we can identify the pigments in it as hematite, actually little red ochre, and red lead pigments. So these are very stable, easily, readily available, dark red pigments mixed into a kind of standard oil-bound deep red. And people would call this a barn red, but honestly, it's used all over New England for houses and outbuildings, and in this case, the meeting house. So looking closely at this pediment, these surfaces are very clean and sharp. And in fact, these are all replacements, right? This got stripped pretty heavily and all these elements, or most of them, got replaced. But there were several found in storage. So I was able to sample a number of them. And you see this had very weathered cream colored paint as one of the earliest layers. So in cross section, you see a little wood at the bottom, and the first layer on top of it is a cream color, repainted cream, and then off-white, a few more cream colors, and again up to the most recent bright white, which is the point at which it was taken off the building. So yes, looks like we have contrasting trim with against a dark red background. And staining with those fluorochromes that I described, there are some carbohydrate reactions in these early cream colors. These could be natural gum additives to aid in grinding the pigments. We have strong oil reactions for all the paints to varying degrees. The weathered paint, you don't get as strong reaction, and no reactions for protein. So traditional, stable, oil-bound, white lead-based cream colored paint here. But other areas of this building you can see must have weathered down to bare wood, because you've got these deep, deep weathered surfaces, and lots of putty filling in the fluting and patching and scraping. You can see the scrape marks here. So the more accessible areas of the trim don't have any early paint evidence, sadly. And this is an example of what happens when a heat gun or a torch is used on wood. So can you see this wood, these little wood fibers are actually blackened, so charred. This would be from using heat to do stripping. And the first layer on top of this charred wood is the 5th generation off-white when it's aligned with the sample from the modillion. So this is an example of an area where you don't have any early surviving paint evidence. So for color matching, this is often the biggest question people have for buildings, not even that they're going to replicate the paint, but in terms of understanding how it fit into the context of its period. So the interior woodwork, very interesting that the soundboard and the Palladian window were this dark grayish color, while the rest of the woodwork that was painted was this lovely light blue. So this area of the Palladian window must have really stood out as a focus when you walked into that space. It's the only one picked out with that darker gray color. And the matches for the deep red is this deep Benjamin Moore color of its historic color palette, which they call Hadley red, and an off-white or a kind of warm white that is very typical of white lead and linseed oil based paints, maybe with a lower grade linseed oil and a little bit of yellow ochre. So how can we understand this period palette with a dark siding and lighter picked out trim? Well, it's helpful sometimes to go to period references. And here we have a mid 18th century painting of the Elisha T. Mills house in Fairfield, Connecticut. So here you've got a dark gray body with the door opening picked out in white, as well as the window frames and cornice. Here the rest of the body of the house is solid color, corner boards not picked out, water table not picked out. And then in this lovely portrait, which is even more relevant, of the same period and local from Bennington, Vermont. Here is this house in the background, which clearly the sitter was very proud of to have included in this painting. And a close-up shows dark yellow siding, white trim for the windows and the door opening. And in this case, the corner boards are also picked out in white. Now, I don't see corner boards often picked out as a contrasting color when I look at houses in this period, both in New England and in the mid-Atlantic states. But here we have a great period reference. So, yep, maybe where the missing information is on the meeting house, we can use period references as guides. I don't think we have a white water table here, but hard to tell because we've got a porch. There are also very important documents that have been published in the proceedings from the New England Meeting House and Church Conference, the Dublin Seminar on Meeting Houses. And these references, this is out of Peter Benish's article on colors. So he writes, the best source of data is the recorded votes of town, parish, or church bodies, which specified meeting house colors in some detail. And what has come down is a particularly vivid selection. The town of Pomfret voted on 26 April 1962 that the new meeting house should be colored on the outside an orange color, the doors and bottom boards a chocolate color, the windows, jets, corner boards, and weatherboards colored white. Really must have been great looking. In a comparable vote made in 1805, he writes, the town of Hampton, Connecticut ordered that its meeting house be painted on the roof and backside red, the foreside ends of a stone yellow, its window frames white, the doors and bottom boards of chocolate color. So these are not unusual, these contrasting palettes, polychrome buildings. He also found a reference in William Bentley's diary, who he writes seemed to favor white. So from Bentley, we learn that the second meeting house in Hatfield had one or more coats of red paint before 1793, that the second meeting house in Lexington, built 1712, was painted yellow, and that the third house in Lexington, which replaced the second in 1796, was painted green, and the sashes and corners painted white. So these are excellent references for understanding what was happening at the meeting house in Rockingham. And I know that people have strong feelings about color. I think this color replication done by Lincoln Brown Illustrations after I put together my first presentation really gives you a sense of what it might have been. So we don't know for sure about corner boards. The evidence doesn't survive, nor does it survive on the cornice or these water table boards. But this is plausible. Yeah, and I think doing something like this really helps you understand better how it started in terms of color. Now, we are very used to white meeting houses, and I'm not proposing repainting this building, especially because its interior really reflects its 1906 restoration. So for architectural historians, this would be called its period of importance, or its interpretation period, or period of significance. So by this point, the red was 100 years in the past or more. But I think in terms of really see the evolution of the building, having this, red-brown discovery really illuminates more about this meeting house and may help change, how we think about how a building like this evolved over time. So just as a reminder, these brilliant pigments, all of them were available in the late 18th, early 19th century in the Connecticut River Valley. So depending on how much money you were willing to spend and whether these were available, and they were probably coming up the Connecticut River, you could have basically any color you wanted. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk again about this great meeting house. And if we have time, I'm happy to answer questions.
Wow.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions?
I know color can be a fraught issue, but I think you don't have to repaint the building to understand, what it looked like.
Yeah, I think
has any, I'll ask this of Walter or of Susan, has anybody attempted a photoshopped a picture of the interior reflecting your conclusions about the colors of paint that might have been there in the quote unquote original form?
Not that I
Not
know
yet,
of,
but
but it would be a great idea.
yeah, not yet, John, but stay tuned. I'm
Okay.
hoping that we will have something in hand within the next several months.
One other question.
That would be great.
In talking to folks over the past several years about the fact that we understood that probably the exterior was painted red, you've added a lot of additional, a lot of science to that conclusion, but it had been
Mhm.
suspected already on the basis of some findings. We've
Mhm.
often said, well, in 1800 or so, at the time that the building was being completed, the white paint was very expensive and was generally imported. Is that an overstatement? You just said a few moments ago that pretty much any color you wanted could be gotten up the Connecticut Valley. Were we overstating the idea that in fact white was sort of out of their budget?
Yeah, I would say that, certainly when you look at advertisements in Boston from color men, and actually in Williamsburg, there are lots of newspaper advertisements for paints that are coming in, being shipped from England. So at this point, virtually everything's coming from England. And vast amounts of white lead in linseed oil is being shipped in barrels. And it's basically a kind of paste that then is thinned with more linseed oil, and it is ubiquitous. It might be slightly more expensive than a deep red paint, but not substantially more. So what's going to be more expensive is the Prussian blue that you see added white lead paint on your woodwork. So of all the pigments that you're finding in this first period, the Prussian blue would be the most costly, and it's clearly making a statement about color being used on the interior there, making this light-filled space even airier and brighter by painting much of the first floor woodwork that Prussian blue color, a light blue, and then having the pulpit area picked out with that deeper dark gray.
Susan, I have a question for you.
Sure.
What if anything can be done about the pews and the leaching oils on people's clothes?
Oh, you would be the one to ask that question, Deb.
I would.
So it's a major conservation project. You can remove these linseed oil coatings from the pews, but you want to be careful the way you do it. So, something really caustic would clean these oils, but it would also raise the grain of the wood. So you want to leave the surface intact, but there are other materials that need to be tested. There are enzymes like lipase that conservators use to remove oily dressings from furniture. So that could be done in a summer project. It needs to be done warmed, and it's kind of finicky, but it works. And also there are certain solvents that can be used to kind of pull the oily materials and the discolored materials from the surface. Again, you'd have to do this with the building thrown wide open because you need ventilation, but I have made some recommendations for conservators in New England who specialize in these types of conservation treatments. So it's doable. It just requires some skill and person power.
I would imagine some expense too, but that's fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah.
That is part of the follow-up. The reason why we wanted to have a look at the finishes inside and outside was to get a better sense of what should we do to do some restoration, to do some conservation work that would not have a negative effect on the wood that is there, particularly the pews, which we know is problematic with that staining when people, especially for weddings, if you can imagine,
Yeah.
in July or August, in a hot, sultry day, folks are in their finery, in their whites and
Right.
light colored clothes, and they sit down and they get up and everyone is covered on the back.
Well, at least it happens to everybody, right? So.
Yeah, but we are, one of the next steps with this, and we are looking at how we can approach this, and maybe as early as this summer, start to do some of the work that that Susan just brought our attention to on the inside, because then I think at this point, the outside of the meeting house has been attended to over the years, I think, painting, but the inside has not been attended to for a good number of years. And it is in need of some TLC, particularly the pews, I think, because because of that oil situation. That's my take.
A question comes in on the chat, which I think is relevant to what you're talking about. What kind of paint was used, if any, on the plaster walls?
Okay, so I didn't talk about plaster, but yes, there are lime washes on the plaster. Those are completely compatible with lime-based plasters. They're exactly what you'd expect for a huge expanse of plaster walls. They are fairly thin, so you still see the texture of the plaster below, and you see some of the graininess of the sand in the plaster. But yeah, this is not at all a surprise, and most of that early evidence still remains on the plaster, which is fantastic.
The walls are going to be a particularly finicky or very touchy kind of conservation effort, in that there's a lot of graffiti that that is under the current layer of whitewash, and depending on the light of day, the time of day, much of that graffiti, some of it very sweet kind of graffiti, people coming, family members coming during, many years after the family may have moved away from Rockingham out west, folks coming back and remembering and putting a little note on the walls. Well, that's beginning to get covered over. And as we do plaster restoration, we want to be very careful that we are not going to cover over a lot of that graffiti.
So Walter, this is an area where I think
have a look at.
Infrared imaging may really help you document this graffiti, because it's the lime washes are pretty translucent in the infrared, and you'd see the pencil lines and whatever charcoal that should be pretty easy to image with an infrared filter. And actually you can get, I think, an infrared app for your iPhone. So I know they've been doing that at Monticello with some great success.
Really? So this is not something
to consider. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is something that one could use an iPhone with an appropriate filter. He wondered out loud. In other words,
I think so. I can get you information on it.
That'd be fantastic. I would really appreciate that. I think it'd be a wonderful thing to be able to image those and then archive those images to conserve their memory. Absolutely, yeah.
I see Lee did have her hand up. Lee, did you want to say something? Lee Parker?
No, I didn't, but I find all this fascinating.
Oh.
We're I'm in Brookline, Vermont, and we have a 1836 brick Baptist church that we're looking at trying to do the right thing with, to bring it back to its original state. So the whole paint piece is really big. We have some moisture that has come up through the soil under the church, and creates like a mold residue on the ceiling, which we're going to need to address at some point. But our pews are wood grain painted, and they're fascinating. So of course we don't want to touch those. Really, they're pretty clean. The pews are actually in really good shape, and the grain is not just on the pews, but it's on all of the woodwork on the inside of the brick church. But no, I find this fascinating, and we will at some point need to get some paint going on inside, but we're gonna have to get the moisture situation figured out, I think.
Yeah, that would be your first step.
Thank you. How do I?
I have a question about painting the roof. Just after you concluded your project, we discovered some bits and pieces of what we believe are some of the original wood shingles from the roof. And initially I didn't pick up, but in the light of day, looking them over some months ago, discovered that there's some red paint on the reveals on at least one of the remnants that we have. This is something that I'll be sending on to you, Susan, to have a look at to see if it matches up with any of the other pigments in the building. But if it was, is it possible that the roof had been painted? Is this a practice that a wood roof, in order to keep it, to add a little bit of life to it, is that something that that happened back in the 18th century, let's say?
Yes, we see it, but more often we see that these roofs are coated with a tar coating. So this would be a natural pine tar, and sometimes pigments were added to the tar. So it turns very blackish over time. So it's hard to tell that if it had a color, but as this cooked pine tar is a kind of brownish coating, and it's used for waterproofing. And that's a pretty standard thing in the 18th century. Certainly we see it a lot in the mid-Atlantic states. And I wouldn't be surprised to see it at the Meeting House. Oh, and sometimes pigments were added to the tar to make it a little bit more durable. So tar looks very different, this natural pine tar, under the microscope than paints. So it'll be interesting to see if that might be what you've got on those shingles.
Yeah, there are 4 or 5 remnants that I'll be sending on to you. Most of them do have a black, very dark gray kind of hue on the reveals, but there's that one piece that has the that very faint redness to it, and that we caught.
Well, we'll see.
We shall.
I have one last question. I'm in Quechee, Vermont, and I would love to come see the Meeting House. When is it open for visitors? Is it closed during the winter months?
It is indeed closed during the winter months. There is no heat, there's no electricity. It's unless you bring in a wood box full of heated soapstone and a blanket or two, it gets pretty chilly up there. So we do not open during the winter. We do open for a season, though. We open over the Memorial Day weekend, that Saturday and of that weekend, and we remain open through Indigenous People Day and the week after Indigenous People Day that weekend. So please do come by.
Standard
We're open
smart
7 days a
practice.
week.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
I'll look forward to it. Thank you.
Well, thank you. We're open 7 days a week, 10 to 4. That's been our general opening hours, and
We'll look forward to it.
look forward to having you and others out there.
Wouldn't it be
Susan, I see-
great to have a virtual tour of the Rockingham Meeting House sometime so that in the winter,
Ooh.
somebody could just
Hmm.
look at it on a virtual way?
That sounds like a wonderful idea. I know that there's a conversation going on right now with amongst some of the commissioners and with some other folks in town about the idea, the concept of story mapping, of doing a GIS story map that might include little video snippets that could be added into them so that someone could take a virtual tour around Rockingham and its history, including then taking peeks inside of some of the buildings.
Right, make it similar to
Sounds
the
great.
Brattleboro Words Project, which is a
Oh.
little bit like that with audio
Oh.
content. Yeah,
The Brattleboro
Words Project.
Project.
Yeah.
I am unfamiliar with that. I
Oh,
would love
really?
to know more.
Yeah, there was a multi-year National Endowment of Humanities grant.
Oh, okay.
Several $100,000 was spent,
Okay.
and what was documented was, for the most part, the literary history of the area.
And I will look into that. Thank you very much for bringing that to my
I'll
attention.
put the link in the chat.
Great, thank you. Thank you indeed.
Well, if there's no more questions, it has been a pleasure to be able to talk about the Meeting House again, and I
Susan,
hope to
it's
return in
Susan.
warm weather again.
Excuse me, Susan, but Annette has had her hand up for a bit.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Susan, hi, it's Annette.
Hi,
I
Annette.
want to thank you so much. It's fascinating. And it was so fascinating to me knowing this was coming up. I went to the a couple places, the library, and also the I was doing research at the Historical Society, and I'm supposed to be doing another grant. But what I found, I was so excited about, and maybe this came up before, but I found other information about the Meeting House and when it was restored in 1906, and it was a special town meeting, and they voted $500 to repair it to try to be put in its original condition as possible. And in it, it states specifically about the graffiti that was on the walls. It said, in their place appeared, the countless names and bits of choice poetry on the walls, which certainly added but little to the dignity of building the building. But then it specifically stated, it talked about the things that they restored, and it talked about replacing the building, the threshold. It talked about putting on a new slate roof and repairing the outside with another coat of fresh white paint, and the complete restoration. And you probably have seen this before, but what I never knew before is this part. In it, it talks about there was this rawhide book, and it was tied with rawhide cord on the back, and it said that it has excellent mementos of the old church, and it was saved by one of the last deacons of the church. And it says that it was recently presented to the old Rockingham Meeting House Association by Mrs. Putnam of Springfield. It is now preserved by the librarian of that association in the vault in the town clerk's office at Bellows Falls. Have you heard this before?
I didn't know that.
And it has a picture of it. It actually has a picture of this leather bound book. And it said that the writing was in excellent condition. It said in 1902, Thomas Bellows of Walpole, one of the original movers of the association, copied almost the entire contents of this valuable old book and had printed a limited edition of 200 copies, thus making them readily available for a large number of people. So, and it talks about this whole manuscript book and everything in the history about it. So I just found this yesterday, and I was supposed to be doing some other research for Walter on a grant. But I found this, I was fascinated, I couldn't stop reading it. So I made copies of these and I was going to try to tell Walter today, but I wonder if we can get a copy of this leather bound book that's supposed to be in the vault at the town clerk's office.
Well, way up on the top shelf, literally way up on the top shelf. I'm gonna have to bring in a ladder and be like Charlie Jarvis when he was out there taking those paint samples. One can see a large wooden box, and on it is scrawled something about old records. And I've got to get up there and have a look at that and bring
I'll
that.
climb up, I'll volunteer, I'll climb up and hand it to you. I
The,
did really good. Ask Gary Fox what happened to me. I climbed up the ladder and found all the old Robertson paper mill records the day before it was going to be destroyed. And I got them
Oh,
all
gosh.
down.
in
Yep.
the meantime, the records which were copied from that book were published and have been republished, and we sell copies of the republication of that at the meeting
Oh,
house.
we
So
do.
if people want the material, if so long as it was copied properly, that's always a question. People want the information from that, it's quite readily available.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry to be so long. I'll thank you again, Ian. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Thanks, Annette.
Yeah, come on.
So that's a good way to end, I think. If nobody else has any questions, thank you again for giving me a chance to talk about this really
Well,
great building.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for making yourself available for us for yet another look at the project. And as we move it along, I will keep you in the loop as we progress with restoration and conservation work that we can now do, I think, with greater confidence than what we had before we had you on board. Thank you.
Sounds
Thank
good.
you
And
very
we'll
much.
learn about the shingle as well.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Come back to
Try get
Vermont,
out in the mail
Susan.
tomorrow.
Mhm.
Bye-bye all.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.